This autumn watercolor is a great lesson for sponging, salting, and using a spoon. We're going to be using a large 2-inch brush today. We'll also be using a nice thick number 8 or 10 round. We'll be using a 6 and a 2 round, also a number 1 rigger and a fine liner. I'm also going to be using my wisp brush for splashing, but you could certainly use your fan. We'll use a sponge. We will use our spoon, a nice plastic spoon or a metal spoon, doesn't matter, and we're going to be using biscuit and salt. Colors today, we will be using some sap green. We will be using burnt sienna. We will be using some burnt umber. We will also be using our yellow ochre. We'll be using cadmium yellow. We'll be using some cadmium red, some cerulean blue, and some black. We'll also be using Chinese white later in the picture. You can see where I put my biscuit. I biscuited out some of the parts on the wagon that I wanted to keep nice and clean, and also some leaves that have fallen on the ground on the lower right. There's really no need to biscuit the lines in the roadway, as you're going to be able to paint around that. So starting in the lower right, I'm using my burnt sienna, and I'm actually painting in some clumps of the leaves that have already fallen to the ground. These are the bigger clumps that I'll paint around later with my green. And when I'm finished painting in these bigger sections of the leaves, I will go ahead and throw some salt on those. While those leaves dry and the salt works for me, I'm going to go back into my background and start putting in the colors for my trees. I'm going to be working light to dark, so I mixed some yellow ochre with just a little bit of my sap green to get my nice yellow color. You could certainly use your cadmium yellow if you wanted it a little bit brighter, or really any color that you'd like, as long as it's going to be your lightest shade. I'm working on the left side of my big tree first, so I do not have to try to put in everything at the same time. And I'm making sure that it's nice and wet so that I can drop in my clumps of really wet sap green into the base where my foliage hits my ground. I don't want this to go, of course, to the very top. This is the lower foliage, more like the bushes versus trees. But I'm dropping in my really wet sap for that to allow it to move through my wet yellow so that I get some nice soft blends with that. Different heights. You don't want everything to be the same height. And then I will also throw on a little bit of salt. I'll be doing the exact same thing on the other side of my tree and in the middle where my tree splits. So nice and wet color down first, and then putting in my secondary color along my my line where my background hits my dirt or my grass. After I've salted, then I'm going to use some very wet black and drop it into the salt at the base just to create some depth back in to those clumps of foliage. So you want to make sure that you're still nice and wet, and I'm putting the dark color into my salt and allowing that to work. I left my right side very muted in color, not a lot of detail because my bigger tree in the foreground is going to go over that section. So I didn't want to go into great detail and then have it covered. Now I'm going to drop in my sienna, same as I did on the right side, but I'm doing it on the left side underneath my two big tree trunks to act as my fallen dried leaves from those trees. Just dry brushing, leaving some big holes that I will paint in later, but this is just straight sienna. You do not have to salt this, but you certainly can if you want to do some extra texturing. And then I also dropped in a little bit of sienna along the base of my tree and bush line in the background. Dry brushing those edges off too so that they're not just a straight smooth line. Now you want to decide for your foreground trees. I did two different trees versus just the one big green tree, but you can do whatever you would like. I'm using my same sienna color, but much more intense, my nice big wide 2-inch brush, and I am using the edge of that brush to create a very uneven edge. I will do that all the way to the height that I want for this first bush, and then I will fill in the middle of that and throw some salt on. I'm also going to be dropping in some very wet black at the base to again show the depth underneath that bush. And after this is totally dry, I will go ahead and sponge on some additional color. So of course you can pick your coloring, what you want for your bush or your small tree. If you don't want a small tree and you want to go with that bigger tree, that's perfectly fine too. But you want to kind of save yourself for your second tree that we're going to put in now, because we're going to be using our spoon for that. I picked a different color for that tree. You don't have to. You can go with the same color, but I'm picking my dark sap for that. So this is sap mixed with a little bit of indigo and also a little bit of black. Same thing, using my nice big 2-inch to get those rough branches on the end, just standing my brush up on the end to create those, and then filling in with solid color. I'm going around all of my coloring for my first bush. Don't worry about filling in all the little inside openings. You can do that anytime, but I don't want a hard edge along my outside branches and leaves, so I'm filling those in rather quickly with nice wet paint. You want to let that get to a matte finish, which means the shine is gone, but it's still wet. And then we're going to use our spoon and scrape out some little branches. So you're holding your spoon with the rounded side to you, the hollow side down. And once you reach that matte finish, we're going to be scraping out some branches. So just like a pine tree, I am scraping out the long branch and then all the smaller branches that come off of it. You have to do this rather quickly because once your paint starts to dry too much, then you're not going to be able to scrape it out. But you will have about a minute to 2 minutes to go ahead and do that. If it's not working for you and you are just getting a darker scrape line of green, that means it's still too wet and you have to wait until it's a little bit drier so that when you are scraping, your paint isn't wet enough that it's going to slide right back into where you scraped. If you want to practice on a smaller sheet of paper first, you can, but this gives a nice look to a pine tree using a spoon. Now you can go ahead and fill in your inner parts if you want, but again, this doesn't have to be something that's done now. It can be done anytime. Going back to the background now, I'm going to start, and I'm using my sponge for this, and I'm going to sponge in my first nice yellow ochre tree. I'm using my sponge, and I want to sponge it around what I've already put down. You don't want to try to go over it because you don't want to lose what you've already done. Press lightly on your sponge so you get a lot of nice holes. And then I'll fill in the center of that tree with a brush. Anywhere else that you want to sponge, remember, don't press too hard on your sponge or you'll just get blobs of circular paint. You won't get the nice holes left from your sponge. I'm putting in my little bit of watered down black at the base to help to separate that out and show some depth into the tree. And I'll throw a little bit of salt on that. You want to allow that to dry well before you start to do any more to the background. So we'll move to a separate area once I get my additional color in there. I'm just using a little bit of black mixed with some umber to deepen some of my leaf colors, and I'm just dropping that right in the salt to allow the salt to dissipate that color. You can add additional colors. I'm putting in a little bit of my sienna, but I wouldn't get too many colors in because you have to leave it another color for your background. I'm going to start to paint in my grass now, so I'll be painting around all of my sienna that is already there. So all of my grassy areas, both in the foreground and the background, I'm just using sap, painting in all around my sienna color, and then I will dry brush that out onto the road areas. Perfect. It's starting to come together a little bit now. So I will make sure everything is really dry. Make sure you have all of your salt removed because we're going to start to paint in the road and you don't want salt marks in your road. This is black mixed with a little bit of cerulean, and I'm painting in my road nice and wet. Mix a nice big puddle of that so you have enough and you don't have to hurry and try to mix more as you're going. And you want to make sure that you are leaving your white lines on your road and your yellow line on your road. You can easily paint around those. Nice and wet so you have a nice even color. And you're going to paint all of your road. Black mixed with a little bit of cerulean blue and a lot of water. Be sure to leave your striping. Now I want to go back to my background and I want to start to fill in the rest of my coloring. And I'm using a little bit of red mixed with some yellow ochre to get like an orangey tone. And I'm going to start to color in all around my colors that are already down. You don't have to worry about all the little inner holes right now because those can be painted in any time. But I'm putting a nice light wash of that orangey color all around my colors that are already down. I will leave some of my lighter green bushes in the front so that I have more than one level, but the rest is painted in that nice orange color, and I will throw in a little bit of salt. I'll also be dropping in that little bit of watered down black just to give the depth and the layers of trees some more identification. Really looks Octoberish now. I'm going to responge that front bush now. I'm using the same color. I'm using my sienna, and I'm just sponging in on top of what's there, just to give the bush the look of some fullness, so that there's more than one color to that. Putting in a little bit more black while it's wet to give that bush a little bit more depth. And again, if you'd like to salt that second layer, you can throw on a little bit of salt. Now I want to roughen up my street a little bit and add some texturing to my street. I didn't want to texture the whole street on my first wash because I didn't want the texturing to be really evident. And if I put it on my first wash and salted it, that salt would take it back to my white paper. So I am putting on a second wash just in sections, in one section closest to my buggy of my watered down black, and I'll salt that. So what's going to happen is that salting is going to take it back to gray. So I'll have my darker color on there, and then my texturing will just look like gray stones or gravel. It won't take it back to white. So just another wash around my buggy with some watered down black, and then I'll go ahead and salt that. Now I'm removing all of my salt because I'm going to start to paint my buggy, and I do not want any salt spots on my buggy. So make sure all of your salt is removed. And then I am painting my buggy and my horse in. I'm going to do my horse first. He is done just with black. Make sure that if you don't have him sketched in first and you would like to sketch him first, that is fine. That way, you won't get his legs too heavy or too long. So you can do it however you want. But I would definitely make sure that, you can see your sketched lines so that your horse doesn't turn out to be too his legs and his hooves don't turn out to be really too big. So paint in your horse first, and then we'll work on the buggy. Now, when you start to work on the buggy, you don't have to do it all at one time, but I am painting it in section by section so that when I cross over and do a wet part over a dry part, I'll get that hard line. That's what's going to help to separate the pieces out. So I did it section by section. Again, you do not have to do it all at one time, but if you want to, that's perfectly fine too. Just make sure that one section is dry before you go on to do the next section. All with black. Also the wheels, you want to make sure that you have those sketched in so that you follow your sketch line so that your wheels don't look lopsided. The two back wheels should be the same height, the two front wheels should be the same height so that they're nice and even. Painting in the wheel sections. If you look at your picture, it does look like some of those sections are very solid, especially the ones on the right versus the ones on the left. So you can paint those solid sections in as triangles, and then some singular spoke lines, but just follow your picture for how you want to paint in those wheels. You can continue to paint in the sections of your wagon, and then we're going to go ahead and start on our big tree trunks. So those nice big tree trunks, I just mixed some umber and some black. I'll paint those in nice and solid. And you can throw some salt on those because those are the nice big thick ones. As you put your tree trunks in the background though, your background trees, you don't need to salt those because you certainly wouldn't see any of the bark texturing on those ones farther in the distance. So paint them in nice and dark with your umber and your black mix, and then we'll move on. Now I'm going to put a shadow in on the road under the buggy because as the buggy is moving down the road, it's creating a shadow. It's not going to be extremely dark, and it's also not going to be really well defined. So when I put my shadow on, I will be using watered down black, and I will be softening the edges with water. Now I'm going to go back up and do some of my details on my wagon and my horse, the reins on the horse, any little bars on the back of the wagon, any little harnesses that you see on the horse, all those fine lines now I'm going to be putting in with my nice fine rigger. I made some additional darker black lines on my wheels just to define some of the spokes. Once that's all dry, I'm going to use my yellow ochre and paint in my yellow stripe on my road. That's just plain yellow ochre. And I'll paint it in nice and smooth on my entire length of my road. Make sure that you don't paint in anything on your white stripes on the road. They can just remain white, the white paper. I'm also filling in now because most of my stuff is done. I'm going to fill in any of my little holes from my sponging. You don't have to fill it in solid, but you want to fill in the color, what would be behind it. So if you have road behind holes in your bushes, you want to go ahead and paint those gray. I took off all of my biscuit now on my buggy, and I'll go ahead and paint in my red reflective lights and my orange and red reflective triangle. I'm redefining my little white dots, my little white, I guess they're secure clips to hold the back of the wagon on, but I'm making sure that if any of them are too big, I'm rounding those off and making them a little bit smaller so that they all are very similar in size. I mixed my cad red and cad yellow to make my orange first on that reflective triangle. And once that's dry, then I'll do the red sides to it. Now I'm going to do a little bit of splattering with my wisp brush. You can also use your fan brush. I'm just using watered down black to put some splashes on the road just to make it look like some loose gravel. And at the very end, I'll also use my wisp to put some splashes on my right hand side there where my bush is of my burnt sienna so that I can make it look like there's some smaller crumpled leaves also in that grassy area. Taking off all my biscuit in my grass, and I will paint those grass pieces in with my sap green before I do any splashing. Paint those in now with some sap green. And once all of the grasses are painted in, if you want to add any extra grasses with your rigger, you can. However, if you miscuted, a decent amount, you probably shouldn't have to add too much to that. When you're done with all of your grasses, then any of the white spots that you left as your individual leaves, dried leaves, you can paint those all in with your sienna color. Make sure that you don't have any white areas left down in that grassy spot. And now that my wagon is nice and dry and that reflective piece is nice and dry, I'll add in my red sides to that, just along the edges, just plain cad red. And now last but not least, I'm going to do my little bits of white highlights. There's not very much, but I'm going to use my Chinese white to do some highlights on the top of the wheels, the top of the buggy. If you darkened the right side of your buggy too much, you might want to put a little wash of white along the right side of the buggy. I used a little bit of my white to kind of highlight the bridle on my horse's mouth, as well as some of the harness. And I also used it to highlight some of the light that's hitting on those bars on the back of the buggy. There's no white anywhere else, nothing on trees or anything like that. It's only on the buggy itself. And my finishing touch then would be my splashing that I mentioned to you earlier with my sienna along the edge of the road there, just to make it look like there are some more dried leaves. And then that should be all. You should be pretty much done with everything. You can refer back to your picture just to make sure that you got everything, but I think you should be happy with it. It's a beautiful October picture. And as always, happy painting.